Tonight's guest, Michele Morano, is a professor of English at DePaul University, and her essays have appeared in a wide variety of journals and anthologies that include the Missouri Review, the Georgia Review, the Fourth Genre, Contemporary Writers on Nonfiction. Her work's been honored by the Rona Jaffe Foundation, the McDowell Colony, the American Association of University Women, the Crab Orchard Review, and the Illinois Arts Council, to name a few. I got to get closer to this mic. Tonight she'll be reading from her wonderful memoir / collection of essays called Grammar Lessons, Translating a Life in Spain. After the reading, as I said, there'll be a Q&A and time for discussion. So please join me now in welcoming Michele Morano.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. It is truly fall now. A couple of days ago, I was starting to complain because I thought it was too warm for late September and I didn't want to go to school. And now I think it's too cold. So some people can never be pleased. I want to thank, first of all, Tom for arranging this and all of his colleagues who have been very welcoming and generous. I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank all of you for coming. And over dinner, we were talking a little bit about study abroad opportunities. So I thought I'd begin tonight by plugging study abroad because it was through study abroad that I first began what has turned into a lifelong relationship with Spain. I was actually a student at a community college in upstate New York, and I was taking during my first semester a Spanish course with a wonderful professor who, I understand now that I am a professor, perhaps he hadn't prepared his lesson one day because we ended up seeing a slideshow from his latest study abroad trip to Spain with students. And I was so taken by how happy everybody looked in the pictures. They were drinking wine and sitting at outdoor cafes and going to museums, and I just thought, wow, I want to do that. And specifically, there were some slides of some paintings in the Prado Museum in Madrid. And I had this sudden desire to be the kind of person who goes to the Prado Museum in Madrid. And I came from a family that did not travel. You know, vacations were really a time to not go to work and stay home and do chores around the house. So travel was considered leisure. It had nothing to do with real life. It wasn't something valuable because you didn't bring home tangible benefits from it. But in that moment in my classroom, I suddenly thought, what if I were the kind of person who would just say, I don't care, I'm going to go anyway. And so I didn't have any money to do this, but I wound up making a plan by which I quit the part-time job I had and got a full-time job and worked for many, many months like crazy to afford a summer study abroad to Spain. And I went for 6 weeks. And it was, in retrospect, not a great trip. It was a good trip, but I think I was mostly just scared almost the entire time. But I enjoyed myself. But the important thing was that when I got back home, I realized that I now was the kind of person who went abroad. And it changed my life completely in exactly the way I had hoped it would. Even though, really, I think I spent most of the time in Spain missing my boyfriend and, you know, being eager to go back home and tell people about my experiences. And then immediately upon arriving home, I just wanted to go back again. And I did finally get an opportunity to go back again when I was a graduate student working on a master's degree. And I had an opportunity to go to Spain and teach English for a year. And it was a bizarre opportunity. I was just about to graduate, and I walked into the English department to check my mail because I was a teaching assistant as well. And the chair of the department walked up to me out of the blue and said, "What language do you speak?" And I said Spanish, very nervously, because in fact I didn't speak Spanish. I had studied it back in college a little bit, and we had to have a language in order to graduate, and I was desperately afraid he was going to quiz me and I wouldn't get my diploma. But in fact, he said, "Well, would you like to go to Spain to teach English for a year?" And I said yes, without knowing anything about the program. And it turned out that someone in Spanish had just called over and said, "We need somebody to go do this teaching exchange. We don't have anyone, do you?" And he said no and threw the paper in the trash. And then I just happened to walk in at the right moment. And the next thing I knew, I was living in Spain for a year, teaching English and having truly the time of my life. But it was not an uncomplicated time. I think that travel is a marvelous thing, and I have done it pretty consistently ever since that first trip to Spain. But As many people have noted, the word travel is rooted in the word travail, which means to work. And I do think that travel often is a lot of work. And in fact, what I've discovered now that I'm a writer is that my favorite part of travel is when I get back home and I write about what happened, because now I know how it turned out. And I know everything went more or less okay, and I can really enjoy the experiences then. So I'm going to read to you an essay. This entire book is really about my experiences living and traveling in Spain, and it's about the complications of travel and the way that travel, especially in a culture that is not your native culture and a language that is not your native language, really can make you reflect on your self-identity and on the stories that you carry around with you. One of the interesting things that happened to me when I was living in Spain was that I made friends, especially because I was working there, and I, in fact, for a long time didn't really know many Americans, so I hung out entirely with Spanish people. And of course, one of the ways that we get to know each other is that we narrate the stories of our lives. We say, oh, you know, I'm this, we don't even say I'm this kind of a person. We say, you know what happened to me once? And we tell these little stories. But when I was telling them in Spanish, and poor Spanish much of the time, I discovered that I couldn't actually say certain things in Spanish the same way I had always said them in English. And so I had to translate my own experiences. And in the process, I realized that our experiences and the stories that we carry around with us that tell us and remind us who we are always up for revision. And that sometimes just by virtue of telling them in a new language, we start to see aspects of them that we hadn't noticed before. And then we understand them in a slightly different way. So that's the sort of long way of introducing this particular essay, which is about learning the subjunctive mood. If any of you are not, well, if you're native English speakers, for example, and you try to learn a language like Spanish, like French, that uses the subjunctive mood, it's the thing that drives you most crazy. Because in English, we don't have the framework for a subjunctive mood, and you need to understand that framework in order to use the verbs properly. So I think that the essay will explain for you what the subjunctive mood is if you happen not to know. And then afterwards, we can talk about it if you'd like. So this essay is titled, In the Subjunctive Mood. Think of it this way. Learning to use the subjunctive mood is like learning to drive a stick shift. It's like falling in love with a car that isn't new or sporty, but has a tilt steering wheel and a price you can afford. It's like being so in love with the possibilities, with the places you might go and the experiences you might have, that you pick up your new used car without quite knowing how to drive it, sputtering and stalling and rolling backward at every light. Then you drive the car each day for months until the stalling stops and you figure out how to downshift, until you can hear the engine's registers and move through them with grace. And later, after you've gained control over the driving and lost control over so much else, you sell the car and most of your possessions and move yourself to Spain, to a place where language and circumstance will help you understand the subjunctive. Remember that the subjunctive is a mood, not a tense. Verb tenses tell when something happens. Moods tell how true. It's easy to skim over moods in a new language or to translate the words and think you've understood, which is why your first months in Spain will lack nuance. But eventually, after enough conversations have passed, enough hours of talking with your students at the University of Oviedo and your housemate Lola and the friends you make when you wander the streets looking like a foreigner, you'll discover that you need the subjunctive in order to finish a question or an answer or a thought you couldn't have had without it. In language, as in life, moods are complicated, but at least in language there are only two. The indicative mood is for knowledge, facts, absolutes, for describing what's real or definite. You'd use the indicative to say, for example, I was in love, or the man I loved tried to kill himself, or I moved to Spain because the man I loved, the man who tried to kill himself, was driving me insane. The indicative helps you tell what happened, or is happening, or will happen in the future when you believe you know for sure what the future will bring. The subjunctive mood, on the other hand, is uncertain. It helps you tell what could have been or might be, or what you want but may not get. You'd use the subjunctive to say, I thought he'd improve without me, or I left so that he'd begin to take care of himself. Or later, after your perspective has been altered by time and distance and a couple of cervezas in a brightly lit bar, you might say, I deserted him, indicative. I left him alone with his crazy self for a year, indicative, because I hoped, after which begins the subjunctive, that being apart might allow us to come together again. English is losing the subjunctive mood. It lingers in some constructions, if he were dead, for example, but it's no longer pervasive. That's the beauty and also the danger of English, that the definite and the might be often look so much alike. And it's the reason why, during a period in your life when everything feels hypothetical, Spain will be a very seductive place to live. In Spanish, verbs change to accommodate the subjunctive in every tense, and the rules, which are many and varied, have exceptions. In the beginning, you may feel defeated by this, even hopeless and angry sometimes. But eventually, in spite of your frustration with trying to explain, you'll know in the part of your mind that holds your stories, the part where grammar is felt before it's understood, that the uses of the subjunctive matter. Number 1, with ojalá. Ojalá means I hope, or more literally, that Allah is willing. It's one of the many words left over from the Moorish occupation of Spain, one that's followed by the subjunctive mood because, of course, you never know for sure what Allah has in mind. During the first months in Spain, you'll use the word by itself, a kind of dangling wish. It's supposed to rain, Lola will say, and you'll respond, ojalá. You'll know you're confusing her, leaving her to figure out whether you want the rain or not. But sometimes the mistakes are too hard to bear. That Allah is willing it wouldn't have raining, you might accidentally say. And besides, so early into this year of living freely, you're not quite sure what to hope for. Each time you say ojalá, it will feel like a prayer, the ha and la like breaths, like faith woven right into the language. It will remind you of La Mezquita, the enormous, graceful mosque in Cordoba, of being 18 years old and visiting Spain for the first time, how you stood in the courtyard filled with orange trees, trying to admire the building before you. You had a fever then, a summer virus you hadn't yet recognized because it was so hot outside. Too hot to lift a hand to fan your face, too hot to wonder why your head throbbed and the world spun slowly around you. Inside, the darkness felt like cool water covering your eyes, such contrast, such relief. And then the pillars began to emerge, rows and rows of pillars supporting red and white brick arches, a massive stone ceiling balanced above them like a thought. You swam behind the guide, not even trying to understand his words, but soothed by the vastness, by the shadows. Each time you felt dizzy, you looked up toward the arches, the floating stone, toward something that felt, you realized uncomfortably, like God, or Allah, or whatever force inspired people to defy gravity this way. Later, after 10 years have passed, after you've moved to Oviedo and become fascinated with the contours of language, the man you left behind in New York will come to visit. You'll travel south with him, returning to La Mezquita on a January afternoon when the air is mild and the orange trees wave tiny green fruit. He'll carry the guidebook, checking it periodically to get the history straight, while you try to reconcile the place before you with the place in your memory, comparing the shadows of this low sun with the light of another season. You'll be here because you want this man to see La Mezquita. You want him to feel the mystery of a darkness that amazes and consoles, that makes you feel the presence in empty spaces of something you can't explain. Approaching the shadow of the door, you'll each untie the sweaters from around your waists, slipping your arms into them and then into each other's. He will squint, and you will hold your breath. Ojalá, you'll think, glimpsing in the shadows the subjunctive mood at work. Number 2, after words of suasion and negation. In Oviedo, you'll become a swimmer. Can you imagine? 2 or 3 times a week, you'll pack a bag and walk for 35 minutes to the university pool, where you'll place clothes and contact lenses in a locker, then sink into a crowded lane. The pool is a mass of blurry heads and arms, some of which know what they're doing, and most of which, like you, are flailing. You keep bumping into people as you make your way from one end of the pool to the other, but no one gets upset, and you reason that any form of motion equals exercise. Then one day, a miracle happens. You notice the guy in the next lane swimming like a pro, his long arms cutting ahead as he glides rhythmically, stroke, stroke, breath. You see and hear and feel the rhythm, and before long, you're following him, stroking when he strokes, breathing when he breathes. He keeps getting away, swimming 3 laps to your 1, so you wait at the edge of the pool for him to come back, then follow again, practicing. At the end of an hour, you realize that this man you don't know, a man you wouldn't recognize clothed, has taught you to swim, to breathe, to use the water instead of fighting against it. For this alone, you'll later say, it was worth moving to Spain. Stroke, stroke, breath becomes the rhythm of your days, the rhythm of your life in Oviedo. All through the fall months, missing him the way you'd miss a limb, your muscles strain to create distance. Shallow end to deep end and back, you're swimming away from memories of abrupt mood shifts, from the way a question, a comment, a person walking past a restaurant window could transform him into a hunched-over man wearing anger like a shawl. From the echo of your own voice trying to be patient and calm, saying, "Listen to me, I want you to call the doctor." In English, you said listen and call, and they were the same words you'd use to relate a fact instead of make a plea. But in Spanish, in the language that fills your mind as you swim continually away, the moment you try to persuade someone or dissuade, you enter the realm of the subjunctive. The verb ends differently, so there can be no mistake. Requesting is not at all the same as getting. Number 3, with si or como si. Si means if. Como si means as if. A clause that begins with si or como si is followed by the subjunctive when the meaning is hypothetical or contrary to fact. For example, if I'd known he would harm himself, I wouldn't have left him alone. But here we have to think about whether the if clause really is contrary to fact. 2 days before, you'd asked him what he felt like doing that night, and he'd responded, "I feel like jumping off the Mid-Hudson Bridge." He'd looked serious when he said it, and even so, you'd replied, "Really? Would you like me to drive you there?" As if it were a joke. If you knew he were serious, that he were thinking of taking his life, would you have replied with such sarcasm? In retrospect, it seems impossible not to have known. The classic signs were there. For weeks, he'd been sad, self-pitying. He'd been sleeping too much, getting up to teach his freshman composition class in the morning, then going home some days and staying in bed until evening. His sense of humor had waned. He'd begun asking the people around him to cheer him up, make him feel better, please. And yet he'd been funny, ironic, self-deprecating, hyperbolic. So no one's saying you should have known, just that maybe you felt a hint of threat in his statement about the river. And maybe that angered you because it meant you were failing to be enough for him. Maybe you were tired too, in need of cheering up yourself because suddenly your perfect guy had turned inside out. Or maybe that realization came later, after you'd had the time and space to develop theories. The truth is, only you know what you know, and what you know takes the indicative, remember? For example, you knew he was hurting himself. The moment you saw the note on his office door in the campus building where you were supposed to meet him on a Sunday afternoon, you knew. The note said, "I'm not feeling well. I'm going home. I guess I'll see you tomorrow." He didn't use your name. You tried calling him several times, but there was no answer, so you drove to the apartment he shared with another graduate student. The front door was unlocked, but his bedroom door wouldn't budge. You knocked steadily but not too loud because his housemate's bedroom door was also closed, and you assumed he was inside taking a nap. If you'd known that his housemate was not actually home, you would have broken down the door. That scenario is hypothetical, so it takes the subjunctive, even though you're quite sure. The human mind can reason its way around anything. On the drive to your own apartment, you told yourself, "He's angry with me. That's why the door was locked, why he wouldn't answer the phone." You thought, "If he weren't so close to his family, I'd really be worried. If today weren't Mother's Day, if he didn't talk so affectionately about his parents, about his brothers and sisters, about our future. If. When the phone rang and there was silence on the other end, you began to shout, "What have you done?" In Spain, late at night over chupitos of bourbon or brandy, you and Lola will trade stories. Early on, you won't understand a lot of what she says, and she'll understand what you say, but not what you mean. You won't know how to say what you mean in Spanish. Sometimes you won't even know how to say it in English. But as time goes on, the stories you tell will become more complicated, more subtle, more grammatically daring. You'll begin to feel more at ease in the unreal. For example, if you hadn't gone straight home from his apartment, if you hadn't answered the phone, if you hadn't jumped back into your car to drive 9 miles in record time, hoping the whole way to be stopped by the police, if you hadn't met him on the porch where he had staggered in blood-soaked clothes, if you hadn't rushed upstairs for a towel and discovered a flooded bedroom floor, the blood separating into water and rust-colored clumps, if you hadn't been available for this emergency. As the months pass in Spain, you'll begin to risk the then. His housemate would have come home and found him the way you found him, deep gashes in his arm, but the wounds clotting enough to keep him alive, enough to narrowly avoid a transfusion. His housemate would have called the paramedics, ridden to the hospital in the ambulance, notified his parents from the emergency room, greeted them after their 3-hour drive. His housemate would have done all the things you did, and he would have cleaned the mess by himself, instead of with your help, the two of you borrowing a neighbor's wet vac and working diligently until you or he or both of you burst into hysterical laughter. Later, this housemate would have moved to a new apartment, just as he has done, and would probably be no worse off than he is right now. You, on the other hand, would have felt ashamed, guilty, remiss for not being available in a time of crisis. But you wouldn't have found yourself leaning over a stretcher in the emergency room, a promise slipping from your mouth before you could think it through. "I won't leave you. Don't worry, I won't leave you," as if it were true. Number 4, after impersonal expressions, such as, "It is possible," "It is a shame," "It is absurd." "It's possible that I'm making things worse in some ways," you told the counselor you saw on Thursday afternoons. He'd been out of the hospital for a few months by then and had a habit of missing his therapy appointments, to which you could only respond by signing up for your own. She asked how you were making things worse, and you explained that when you told him you needed to be alone for a night and he showed up anyway at 11 p.m., pleading to stay over, you couldn't turn him away. She said, "It's a shame he won't honor your request," and you pressed your fingernails into the flesh of your palm to keep your eyes from filling. She asked why you didn't want him to stay over, and you said that sometimes you just wanted to sleep without waking up when he went to the bathroom and listening to make sure he came back to bed instead of taking all the Tylenol in the medicine cabinet, or sticking his head in the gas oven, or diving from the balcony onto the hillside 3 stories below. "There is nothing," you told her, "nothing I haven't thought of." She said, "Do you think he's manipulating you?" And you answered in the mood of certainty, "Yes, absolutely." Then you asked, "Isn't it absurd that I let him manipulate me?" And what you wanted, of course, was some reassurance that it wasn't absurd, that you were a normal person reacting in a normal way to a crazy situation. Instead, she said, "Let's talk about why you let him. Let's talk about what's in this for you." Number 5, after verbs of doubt or emotion. You didn't think he was much of a prospect at first, because he seemed arrogant. Because in the initial meetings for new instructors, he talked as if he were doing it the right way and the rest of you were pushovers. Because he looked at you with one eye squinted, as if he couldn't quite decide. You liked that he was funny, a little theatrical, and a great fan of supermarkets. At 10 p.m. after evening classes ended, he'd say, "Are you going home?" Sometimes you'd offer to drop him at his place. Sometimes you'd agree to go out for a beer. And sometimes you'd say, yeah, but I have to go to the store first. And his eyes would light up. In the supermarket, he'd push the cart and you'd pick items off the shelf. Maybe you'd turn around and there would be a whole rack of frozen ribs in your cart. Or after you put them back, 3 boxes of Lucky Charms. Maybe he'd be holding a package of Pfeffernüsse and telling a story about his German grandmother. Maybe it would take 2 hours to run your errand because he was courting you in ShopRite. You doubted that you'd sleep with him a second time. After the first time, you both lay very still for a while, flat on your backs, not touching. He seemed to be asleep. You watched the digital clock hit 2:30 a.m. and thought about finding your turtleneck and sweater and wool socks, lacing up your boots and heading out into the snow. And then out of the blue, he rolled toward you, pulled the blanket up around your shoulders and said, "Is there anything I can get you? A cup of tea? A sandwich?" You were thrilled at the breaks in his depression, breaks that felt like new beginnings every time. Days, sometimes even weeks, when he seemed more like himself than ever before. Friends would ask how he was doing, and he'd offer a genuine smile. "Much better," he'd say, putting his arm around you. "She's pulling me through the death wish phase." Everyone would laugh with relief, and at those moments you'd feel luckier than ever before because of the contrast. Do you see the pattern? Number 6, to express good wishes. "Que tengas muy buen viaje," Lola will say, kissing each of your cheeks before leaving you off at the bus station. May you have a good trip, a hope, a wish, a prayer of sorts, even without the ojalá. The bus ride from Oviedo to Madrid is nearly 6 hours, so you have a lot of time for imagining. It's 2 days after Christmas, and you know he spent the holiday at his parents' house, that he's there right now, maybe eating breakfast, maybe packing. Tonight his father will drive him to Kennedy Airport, and tomorrow morning, very early, you'll meet him at Barajas in Madrid. You try to envision what he'll look like, the expression on his face when he sees you, but you're having trouble recalling what it's like to be in his presence. You try not to hope too much, although now, 4 months into your life in Spain, you want to move toward instead of away. Toward long drives on winding mountain roads, toward the Cathedral of Toledo, the mosque at Cordoba, the Alhambra in Granada, toward romantic dinners along the Mediterranean, toward a new place from which to view the increasingly distant past. You want this trip to create a separation, in your mind and in his, between your first relationship and your real relationship, the one that will be so wonderful, so stable, you'll never leave him again. Once you've reached Madrid and found the pension where you've reserved a room, you'll get the innkeeper to help you make an international call. His father will say, "My God, he can't sit still today." And then there will be his voice asking how your bus ride was, where you are, how far from the airport. You'll say, "I'll see you in the morning." He'll reply, "In 17 hours. The next morning, the taxi driver is chatty. He wants to know why you're going to the airport without luggage, and your voice is happy and excited when you explain. He asks whether this boyfriend writes you letters, and you smile and nod at the reflection in the rearview mirror. "Many letters?" he continues. "Do you enjoy receiving the letters?" In Spain, you're always having odd conversations with strangers, so you hesitate only a moment, wondering why he cares, and then you say, "Yes, very much." He nods emphatically, "Muy bien." At the terminal, he drops you off with a broad smile. "Que lo pases bien con tu novio," he says. "Have a good time with your boyfriend." In his words, you hear the requisite subjunctive mood. Number 7, in adverbial clauses denoting purpose, provision, exception. How different to walk down the street in Madrid, Toledo, Cordoba, to notice an elaborate fountain or a tiny car parked half on the sidewalk and comment aloud. You've loved being alone in Spain, and now, even more, you love being paired. On the 5th day, you reach Granada, find lodging in someone's home. Down the hallway, you can hear the family watching TV, cooking, preparing to celebrate New Year's Eve. In the afternoon, you climb the long, slow hill leading to the Alhambra and spend hours touring the complex. You marvel at the elaborate irrigation system, the indoor baths with running water, the stunning mosaic tiles and views of the Sierra Nevada. Here is the room where Boabdil signed the city's surrender to Ferdinand and Isabella. Here is where Washington Irving lived while writing Tales of the Alhambra. Occasionally you separate as he inspects a mural and you follow a hallway into a lush courtyard, each of your imaginations working to restore this place to its original splendor. When you come together again, every time, there's a thrill. He looks rested, relaxed, strolling through the gardens with his hands tucked into the front pockets of his pants. When you enter the patio of the lions, the famous courtyard where a circle of marble lions project water into a reflecting pool, he turns to you wide-eyed, his face as open as a boy's. Isn't it pretty? You keep asking, feeling shy because what you mean is, are you glad to be here? So pretty, he responds, taking hold of your arm, touching his lips to your hair. The day is perfect, you think. The trip is perfect. You allow yourself a moment of triumph. I left him so that he would get better without me, and he did. I worked hard and saved money and invited him on this trip in case there's still hope for us, and there is. Unless. In language, as in experience, we have purpose, provision, exception, none of which necessarily matches reality, and all of which take the subjunctive. On the long walk back down the hill toward your room, he turns quiet. You find yourself talking more than usual, trying to fill the empty space with cheerful commentary, but it doesn't help. The shape of his face begins to change until there it is again, that landscape of furrows and crags. The jaw thrusts slightly, lips pucker, eyebrows arch as if to say, I don't care about anything. Back in the room, you ask him what's wrong, plead with him to tell you. You can talk about anything, you assure him, anything at all. And yet you're stunned when his brooding turns accusatory. He says it isn't fair. You don't understand how difficult it is to be him. Your life is easy, so easy that even moving to a new country, taking up a new language is effortless, while every day is a struggle for him. Don't you see that? Every day is a struggle. He lowers the window shade and gets into bed, his back turned toward you. What to do? You want to go back outside into the mild air and sunshine, walk until you remember what it feels like to be completely alone. But you're afraid to leave him. For the duration of his 90-minute nap, you sit paralyzed. Everything feels unreal. The darkened room, the squeals of children in another part of the house, the burning sensation in your stomach. You tremble, first with sadness and fear, then with anger. Part of you wants to wake him, tell him to collect his things, then drive him back to the airport in Madrid. You want to send him home again, away from your new country, the place where you live unencumbered, but with a good deal of effort, thank you. The other part of you wants to wail, to beat your fists against the wall and howl, give him back to me. Remember, purpose, provision, exception. The subjunctive runs parallel to reality. Number 8. After certain indications of time, if the action has not occurred. While is a subjunctive state of mind. So are until, as soon as, before, and after. By now you understand why, right? Because until something has happened, you can't be sure. In Tarifa, the wind blows and blows. You learn this even before arriving, as you drive down Route 15 past Gibraltar. You're heading toward the southernmost point in Spain, toward warm sea breezes and a small town off the beaten path. You drive confidently, shifting quickly through the gears to keep pace with the traffic around you. He reclines in the passenger seat, one foot propped against the dashboard, reading from the Real Guide open against his thigh. Spreading out beyond its Moorish walls, Tarifa is known in Spain for its abnormally high suicide rate, a result of the unremitting winds that blow across the town and its environs. You say, tell me you're joking. He says, how's that for luck? 3 days before, you'd stood in Granada's crowded city square at midnight, each eating a grape for every stroke of the new year. If you eat all 12 grapes in time, tradition says, you'll have plenty of luck in the coming year. It sounds wonderful, such an easy way to secure good fortune, until you start eating and time gets ahead, so far ahead that no matter how fast you chew and swallow, midnight sounds with 3 grapes left. In Tarifa, you come down with the flu. It hits hard and fast. 1 minute you're strolling through a whitewashed coastal town, and the next you're huddled in bed in a stupor. He goes to the pharmacy and with a handful of Spanish words and many gestures procures the right medicine. You sleep all day, through the midday meal, through the time of siesta, past sundown and into the evening. When you wake, the room is fuzzy and you're alone, with a vague memory of him rubbing your back, saying something about a movie. Carefully you rise and make your way to the bathroom, holding on to the bed, the doorway, the sink, then stand on your toes and look out the window into the blackness. By day, there's a thin line of blue mountains across the strait, and you imagine catching the ferry at dawn and watching that sliver of Morocco rise up from the shadows to become a whole continent. You imagine standing on the other side and looking back toward the tip of Spain, this tiny town where the winds blow and blow. That's how easy it is to keep traveling once you start, putting distance between the various parts of your life, imagining yourself over and over again into entirely new places. Chilly and sweating, you make your way back to bed, your stomach fluttering nervously. You think back to Granada, how he'd woken up from a nap on that dark afternoon and apologized. "I don't know what got into me today," he'd said. "This hasn't been happening." You believe it's true, it hasn't been happening, but you don't know how true. You think, "He's fine now, there's no need to worry, he's been fine for days, happy and calm, I'm overreacting." But overreaction is a slippery slope. With the wind howling continuously outside, the room feels small and isolated. You don't know that he's happy today and calm right now, do you? You don't know how he is at all because you've slept and barely talked to him. You think, if the movie started on time, but movies never start on time in Spain, so you add, subtract, try to play it safe, and determine that by 10:45 p.m. your fretting will be justified. At 11 o'clock, you'll get dressed and go looking, and if you can't find him, what will you do? Wait until midnight for extra measure and then call the police? And tell them what? That he isn't back yet and you're afraid because you're sick and he's alone and the wind here blows and blows enough to make people crazy, the book says, enough to make them suicidal? This is the when, the while, the until, the before and after, the real and the unreal in precarious balance. This is what you moved to Spain to escape from, and here it is again, following you. The next time you wake, the room seems brighter, more familiar. You sit up and squint against the light. His cheeks are flushed, hair mussed from the wind. His eyes are clear as a morning sky. "Hi, sweetie," he says, putting a hand on your forehead. "You still have a fever. How do you feel?" He smells a little musty, like the inside of a community theater where not many people go on a Sunday night in early January. He says the movie was hilarious. You ask whether he understood it, and he shrugs. Then he acts out a scene using random Spanish words as a voiceover, and you laugh and cough until he flops down on his stomach beside you. Here it comes again, the contrast between what was just a little while ago and what is now. After all this time and all these miles, you're both here in a Spanish town with a view of Africa. You feel amazed, dizzy, as if swimming outside yourself. You're talking with him, but you're also watching yourself talk with him, and then you're sleeping and watching yourself sleep, dreaming and thinking about the dreams. Throughout the night, you move back and forth, here and there, between what is and what might be, tossed by language and possibility and the constantly shifting wind. Number 9, in certain independent clauses. There's something extraordinary, isn't there, about learning to speak Spanish as an adult, about coming to see grammar as a set of guidelines, not just for saying what you mean, but for understanding the way you live. There's something extraordinary about thinking in a language that insists on marking the limited power of desire. For example, at Barajas Airport in Madrid, you walk him to the boarding gate. He turns to face you, hands on your arms, eyes green as the sea. He says, "Only a few more months and we'll be together for good, right, sweetie?" He watches your face, waiting for a response, but you know this isn't a decision, something you can say yes to. So you smile, eyes burning, and give a slight nod. What you mean is, "I hope so." What you think is, "Ojalá," and what you know is this. The subjunctive is the mood of mystery, of luck, of faith interwoven with doubt. It's a held breath, a hand reaching out, carefully touching wood. It's humility, deference, the opposite of hubris. And it's going to take a long time to master. But at least the final rule of usage is simple, self-contained, one you can commit to memory. Certain independent clauses exist only in the subjunctive mood, lacing optimism with resignation, hope with heartache. Be that as it may, for example, or the phrase one says at parting, eyes closed as if in prayer, may all go well with you. Thank you. I should have told you at the beginning that there are 9 sections. It helps if you don't think that there are 25 coming as you're sitting there listening. I will be happy to take questions if anyone has something they'd like to know about anything. I'll make up answers if I need to. Yes?
Were you describing somebody with manic depressive disorder?
I was describing somebody who was depressed. I think there were also times when he was a little bit manic, but I don't think he was ever, the label manic depression was ever actually affixed to him by somebody with the credentials to do that. Yeah, but, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yeah.
How much Spanish did you know when you first went to Spain? And where did you go when you first went to Spain?
When I first went to Spain, I went to Valencia on the Mediterranean coast. And I thought I knew a lot of Spanish because I had studied it in high school, and then I'd had a year of college, and off I went and didn't understand anything anyone said to me. So I had that horrible rude awakening when you realize that study as you might, and I had studied really hard in preparation for the trip too. I did all the exercises in an entire grammar book that summer getting ready to go. And it just doesn't matter if you haven't been, I mean it matters, yes. I could read a menu. But it did not matter in having conversations with people. So that practice is just so incredibly important. Yeah. And then I didn't study Spanish for a long, long time, and I didn't use any of the Spanish I had studied until I arrived in Oviedo. And at least I wasn't as shocked then because I sort of knew I wasn't going to be able to speak right away. But it was amazing how immersing yourself, when you have to speak, you speak. You know, you figure out ways to communicate. Yeah.
When did you write the book? Was it during the trip? Or?
No, oh goodness, no. No, I started writing the book a few years ago when I was working on my PhD, and I was working on my, I just wanted to accumulate degrees, so I was working on a PhD and an MFA at the same time. I did everything backwards. And so this collection began as a little piece of my doctoral dissertation. And I just took a couple of essays from that and built a book around it. So it was many, many years. It was at least, when I first started writing the essays, it was probably about 7 or 8 years after I lived in Spain. Because it had taken me that long really to kind of process things that happened there and also to become a writer. I didn't think of myself as a writer when I was living there. And then when I finally did start to write personal essays and realize that I could tell my own stories and that might be interesting to readers, then I was drawn to this material. Yeah. Yes?
So did you start by writing personal essays and then the idea of connecting them to the grammar came to you, or how did that sort of work?
That's a really interesting question. I'm pretty sure that idea came to me in a bar. And I think I know exactly who I was with, and I can almost tell you what kind of beer I was drinking. And I was writing personal essays at that point, but I hadn't, I had wanted to write about this relationship for a very long time. Well, a few years. And I just couldn't figure out how to do it. Because when you have, it's horrible to say, but it was dramatic material, but it wasn't so dramatic, right? Because he didn't actually succeed. And so it wasn't one of those super tragic stories, but I thought it was an interesting story that doesn't get told very much about what it's like to be involved with someone who you fear is going to commit suicide. And but I didn't know how to tell it because I just felt like if I told it in a straightforward way, it wasn't even keeping me interested, let alone a reader. And so I was sitting in this bar with a friend, and she was taking, because we had to do this language requirement for the PhD as well, she was taking French and complaining about the subjunctive mood. And I remember thinking, oh yeah, that was horrible for me in Spain. And we got talking about this idea of moods, and suddenly I thought, oh my gosh, a mood disorder and grammatical moods, like I think this could be something. And so the whole book really started with that one essay. And it's called Grammar Lessons, and a few of the essays deal with actual grammar, but if the whole book dealt with it, really, who wants to write or read that? So a lot of the essays deal with more metaphoric forms of grammar. So when you're living in a new culture, you learn to read body language, and you learn to understand that two men walking down the street holding hands aren't necessarily a couple, which even after a year of living there, I still kept going, oh, look at that sweet little romantic, oh no, that's not a romance, and so it was constantly, you constantly kind of revert back to what's most normal, most usual to you. So there are a lot of essays that don't deal with linguistic grammar, but rather with a metaphoric kind of grammar. Yeah.
So you spoke earlier about how learning a new language that has a subjunctive mood gave you some insights into the situation, this relationship that you might not have had if you had now, got better with Spanish. What insights would you say that you gained as a result of knowing Spanish and subjunctive mood?
Well, I think that idea that that in English we often speak about things as if they were true, when in fact we're not sure. I miss the subjunctive. You would think after researching this essay, and it's all correct, like I had 3 native Spanish speakers vet it, there's not a mistake in that essay. You would think I would be able to use the subjunctive as well as anybody, but in fact, a very good friend of mine who lives in Spain, every time we visit each other, she just pats me on the shoulder and says, one day you'll be able to speak in the subjunctive. And we both know it's not true. But I miss it in English. There are times when I want to say something, and I really do want to emphasize that who knows, but you can't just do that in the sentence. In other words, you want it to be true and possibly not true both at the same time in the grammar of it. So I think that awareness, and also what I said before about that idea of revising your stories. When you start to think about what did I believe at the time, and how much of that was I right to believe, and how much of that was naive optimism, and those sorts of things play in your mind. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
How has living in Spain changed you? It seems like such a positive experience and you know it so much. How has it changed your life?
Yeah, it was absolutely a hugely positive experience. Well, I think for one thing, living anywhere for any amount of time, even if it's only a month or a few weeks, if it's a language that is not a native language to you, it is a tremendously humbling experience. You make an ass out of yourself every single day. You cannot help it. You say ridiculous things. You speak like a child. I love speaking to children in Spain because we get each other completely, And in fact, my friend Yolanda, who I was just talking about a moment ago, when I was staying with her once, her 4-year-old daughter kept correcting my language. She would say, "You don't say it like that." And I'd say, "Well, tell me, Luisa, how do I say it?" But I could also correct some of her language, which pleased me to no end. So I just think there's a certain, you cannot take yourself very seriously when you're living in a new culture, at least for a time. And so it just gave me sort of more of an appreciation for the absurd, but it also gave me a really interesting, and this is another plug for study abroad, it's a really interesting thing to view your own country from abroad and to read newspaper articles and to recognize that I don't know, in El País, there's plenty of entertainment gossip, but it's way at the back of the paper. And, the first 3 pages are international news, and the U.S. is a very small part of that often. And not, you have to dig really in U.S., apart from the New York Times, you have to dig in U.S. papers for international news. I watch the Spanish TV channels for news sometimes here because I feel like I don't really have a sense of what's going on in the world watching U.S. news stations. So yeah, those sorts of things change you as well. Yeah.
Was going with a specific travel abroad program helpful to you, or would you recommend just traveling to travel?
I think I've done both, and I think that it's, especially if it's your first time, I think it's really good to be with a program, because it's tremendously helpful to have people there who are good resources for you and who you can go to. And also, I think it's hard to travel if you don't have a purpose. When you wake up that first morning and you have to fill your own day, that's terrible. You know, it sounds great because freedom is supposed to be wonderful, but when you're sitting there with the guidebook going, okay, where do I get breakfast? You know, that's not so much fun. So I think it's always good if you have some situation that gives you a routine immediately and kind of gets you settled in the place. It also is good for jet lag. There's nothing worse for jet lag than sleeping half the day. You got to get up and have some place to go. And then you just acclimate yourself into the routine of the place where you are. Yeah.
Forgive me if I'm being too personal, but how did you perceive the death threats to himself and in the eyes of some people?
Right.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. That's an interesting question, too. How did I perceive the sort of death threats? Well, and I was very much in love at the time, which is probably why I did a lot. I was very frightened. I was really frightened that he would kill himself. And at a certain point, though, I had to acknowledge that ultimately I couldn't do anything about that was going to be his decision, and I could support him as much as I wanted to. So that was a really bizarre thing, and that's also why the subjunctive felt so comfortable to me, I think, even when I couldn't use it very well, is that I was living at that time feeling like he's going to die. I want to marry him. You know, so my future could look like this, and my future, I could carry with me for the rest of my life the sorrow of not having had this because he might die. And so it was really, really difficult. It was horribly difficult. And there actually was a period when he was, when the worst period actually wasn't the suicide attempt. It was about 4 months later, where I actually thought that he might become physically violent toward other people, including me. And that was really scary too, because I just thought, I'm not sure what to do now. But you know, that it was a very short-lived period, and things sort of came to a crisis, and he did go into counseling and start keeping his appointments a little bit more. So it was actually a good thing in the end. Yeah, but that was hard. Yeah. Yes, Jackie.
It seems like your book came out at a time when people have a real thirst for women's travel stories, right? Like, I wonder if you had any theories about that?
I do. Thank you. I do have theories about that. I think that travel has long been associated with adventure. And so even if you read Best American Travel Essays, which comes out every year, and the essays are always fabulous, but 90% of them involve scaling some mountain or being in a plane crash or having some other kind of big, bold adventure that most of us are not going to do. And those are interesting stories, but they're not the only kind of travel stories. And at the risk of totally overgeneralizing, I think that's kind of a male story. And I think that women's travel writing provides something else, which has to do with the complications and the beauty and the disappointments of everyday life in travel. And so I think there is a real thirst for that and a real hunger for it. I have a colleague who said something to me recently about how if you're writing, this is actually categorized as a travel memoir, even though I wasn't thinking of it as memoir. I was thinking of it as a collection of essays. But apparently memoir is more marketable, so that's what it says on the back of the book. And he was saying, you know, if you're going to write a memoir, you have to have a really big story. You have to have something really major, or you have to be related to somebody famous. Like, you have to have a big story. And I was just thinking, all the books I love are not about that. You know, I'm not so interested in, I can see big stories every day on, you know, people.com. What I'm interested in is how people negotiate their daily lives, and also how, as writers, they look back with a certain perspective that they've developed over time. So I'm interested in how people understand the events. I want a good story too, but a good story I don't think has to mean that you risked your life, literally. You know? I think that's part of it. Yes?
I find the story and your descriptions of the subjunctive mode, or mood, a very good tool for me and I'm a Spanish native speaker, it's a very good educational tool to teach the subjunctive.
Mm-hmm.
No,
Subjunctive, yeah, but see, you're a native Spanish speaker.
see, but the other day I tried to explain that, and I couldn't.
Yeah, yeah. That's the same way native English speakers cannot explain our own grammar, because you don't learn it by rules, you absorb it. It's part of the way your mind works, and it's only if you start to teach that you actually use, or become an editor or something, that you actually start to learn the rules. As Joan Didion says, grammar is a piano I play by ear. All I know about grammar is its power. You know, so I think that's really true, that you don't necessarily pay attention in your own language. Yeah. No, over there. I'll get back to you.
In your book, you're exploring your experiences through grammar, and like you said, translating your story. But it seems like the theme of desire runs through a lot of the essays as well. And I was just wondering, is that sort of the metaphorical grammar that you were talking about? So was it something that you were aware of as you were writing, or was that a theme that kind of just emerged as you were writing?
I think it emerged, the theme of desire is what she's asking about, and I think it emerged early on, and I was aware of it. I just think that travel it's all about desire for me. You know, I just go from one desirous state to another when I'm traveling. I want to ingest things, and I want to absorb, and so, and you know, that desire is often thwarted. You want a certain kind of experience, and you end up having, you know, not that experience at all in a particular place, and part of the fun and also the complication of travel is that you never know on any given day if your desire is going to be met or if you're going to end up really frustrated. So yeah, I think desire is is absolutely a sort of state of being. Yeah. Is there someone over here? Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, are you working on any new works about any travels?
I am, actually. I'm working on some material right now about my most recent, you know, I thought I was done with Spain. Like this book, I did Spain, you know, so let's move on to something else. But then last year, right about this time, I left for a 3-month trip in Madrid to lead DuPage's study abroad program. And I had had a baby not long before that. So off I went with my partner and our 5-month-old. And I just thought, you know, I'd never had a baby before. And I thought, well, you know, he's small. I'll just strap him on and away we'll go. You know, this will be great. And I was telling the students ahead of time, oh, we're going to go on all the trips with you. As long as the baby isn't a real crier, we're going to go on all the trips with you. Oh my God, I had no idea. So we get to Madrid and we can't do anything. I mean nothing, because this kid wants to nap 3-4 times a day and he's got to be in the crib every time, you know. So here I am like a week into the stay in Madrid just looking around saying, I have never been so bored in my life. And when is this going to stop, you know? And so it ended up being this really interesting time, because rather than bounding around the country on weekends, and I had like a 4-day weekend every week and I couldn't go anywhere. So rather than bounding around, what I ended up doing was living really intensely in this neighborhood that I lived in. Like we walked the streets constantly. We went to the same coffee shop. The baby turned into the rock star, you know, the little American baby. Because Spanish people dress their babies too. Like it's astonishing. Like these babies rode around in these like Cadillac strollers with these beautiful duvets, like pink or blue, and their little bonnets. It was like something beautiful. And our kid's wearing like hand-me-downs. He looks like a skateboarding teenager with his little cargo pants and sweatshirts, and everyone's looking at him like, oh my God, obviously you don't love your child. So it was sort of humiliating in a bunch of ways I hadn't expected. So I'm working on material about that, you know, about what it means to sort of suddenly discover yourself traveling in a totally different way, and having to kind of rise to the occasion of eventually saying, okay, yes, he is dressed that way, and that's the clothes we have, and I'm not buying one of those comforters for our rickety little travel strollers. So it's another way of looking at cultural differences. Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
How do you mark the line between fiction and nonfiction? And then what are some difficulties that you personally face when writing this or any other nonfiction?
Good question. I would have planted that question if I had known ahead of time. No, that's a very good question. I think that whenever you're working on material from your own life and from your past and from memory, there's always going to be gray areas. There's the stuff that you absolutely know it happened. There's the stuff you can document because you have photos or letters or maps or journal entries. And then there's all the gray area in between. Now, there are some nonfiction writers, usually people who are trained as journalists, who believe that if you can't absolutely verify that it happened, you can't write about it. And then there are those of us on the other end of the spectrum, mostly trained as fiction writers, who say, sure you can. That imagination is a part of memory, always. I mean, as soon as something happens, the next time you call it up from your memory, you are imagining details as well. And so, my rule of thumb is as long as I'm not embellishing anything that couldn't have been, as long as I'm not dressing anybody in an outfit that they absolutely never would have worn or anything like that, then I feel like I'm on okay ground. But this essay is a really interesting case in point because wherever I've gotten in trouble in my nonfiction, it's been because I fictionalized something. So when I was writing this essay initially, for some reason I thought it was too complicated to be in Cordoba at the mosque in one scene and then in Granada at the Alhambra in another scene. So I put that whole business about him having a fit the one day and falling into a depression, I set that in Cordoba. And this essay, I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but I'll say it anyway because it might be instructive. It took me 6 years to finish this essay. So I wrote the first draft, and then I kept taking it out and playing with it, and at one point I broke it. It didn't work at all, and I actually had to go back to the initial draft and then cut and paste from the later versions to try to and I could not figure out what was wrong with it. And then I just sat down one day and said, what's not true? Something's not true. And I went through the whole essay and I said, this did not happen in Cordoba. It happened in Granada. And so let me just take that section out entirely and put it where it belongs. And once I did that, I think I captured something in that section that had been missing in the whole essay, which had to do with the pleasure of being back with him again. And the way the relationship, when things were good, it was great. And so once I had that back, I thought, there. Now I feel like it's complete. I mean, it wasn't as simple as all that. I had to do a few more revisions. But so I teach creative nonfiction courses, and I always tell my students when they're really struggling with something, I say, chances are something's not true, and you have to figure out what it is. So, that's why I think nonfiction is so interesting too, though, because you're always negotiating with yourself. Most of the time, honest to God, he wouldn't have remembered where that took place. I could have said it in, New York, and he would have said, oh yeah, that was a terrible day, wasn't it? I mean, and so it was really just me and myself working out what's true and what isn't. And I think that's the fascinating thing. It keeps you in a certain way honest. And yet I have to go through that same negotiation with the next piece I write and the next piece, because there's no rule that says, well, as long as you do this, you're on safe ground. You have to constantly be working with what the reader needs from you by way of details and scene and all the stuff that makes us feel we've entered an experience and what you can pull up from your memory. Yes?
How do you communicate with somebody in the subjunctive mood to somebody who has a business mood?
Well, I think I tried to do it in this essay by giving the rules. And then also by I wasn't even so interested in the actual, I thought this essay was going to be easy to write. I just thought, I had the idea and I thought, let me just get out my grammar book. There we go. Nine rules. I'll type them in. I'll just fill it in with stories. How hard can that be? But it turns out that the stories were the really hard part, that illustrating it at work was much harder. But I also think it makes you understand a little more than just reading rules and seeing examples of sentences, what the whole subjunctive mood is. Yeah. Yes, Tom?
I'm going to follow up on your question. The novelist's truth versus the essayist's truth. So when you were creating the scene of like in the bar and you're, coming up from memory, which is the truth you create, what can't you do as an essayist? Like, can you invent? You think it's okay to invent colors, to invent the scene, or is invention okay? We've been talking about this in our class.
Right.
Murky.
Invention is a curious word there. I would use the word imagine more, because I think that, and I've had examples where I've written something and then I've gone back to a place and realized that my description is not accurate, But there's a great line in the acknowledgments page of Tobias Wolff's memoir, This Boy's Life, which you should all read. It's fabulous. And he says in the acknowledgments page that he was corrected on some minor details, including a dog that he called homely his mother thought was really quite handsome. And for the most part, he had let his details stand because memory has its own story to tell. So I live by that line because I feel like I'm always trying to tell the story of memory. I'm never claiming that I'm telling a story that will stand up in a court of law, but this is the way I remember it. And so if I'm imagining, if my memory is not entirely clear, but I can imagine it into more clarity, I think that's okay. I also think it's okay. On occasion, you have to get rid of people, and they don't like it when you do that. But if you had a conversation with 6 people, and the reader's not going to be able to follow 6 people, and you're going to be doing backflips to try to work them all in, well, if you have to make 2 of them into 1 person and get rid of a couple more, especially if they're family members, they get very irritated with this. But you have to do it, because the main object here is to communicate something, not, again, to create testimony. But there are people who think that should not be allowed, and that's fine. They don't have to do it. Did you have a question?
I was just thinking about memoir, and a lot of people tell a compelling story, like yours was a personal story. Do you think that's necessary in that form to reveal yourself, to make something have essence?
I don't think it's ever necessary to tell anyone something you don't want to tell them. So I've read perfectly fine memoirs that don't turn inward very much, that are much more about events or about other people, and I think that's perfectly fine. But it's interesting because sometimes, not so much in this essay, but I have another essay in the book called In Praise of Envy, which is about a little period of my life where I did some stalking. And, that's not something you're supposed to necessarily admit to everybody. And I remember I was going to visit a class once, and a class of a friend of mine, and as we were just about to walk into the room, he turned to me and said, "Are you sure you're okay with this?" And it was clear he was a little embarrassed for me. And I thought, honey, the embarrassing stuff I have not gone near. Like, I'm fine with stalking, whatever embarrasses you is not about what embarrasses me, So it was very funny. But I do think that, you shouldn't ever feel compelled to tell any story you don't want to tell. Yeah. Yes.
How do you choose a theme? A lot of this seems to be, you've got a lot of facts, a lot of memories, but how do you organize them together?
Well, I think Tom and I were just talking about this before, about how do you, generate the material and figure out what's what. I just dump stuff onto the page. I just make messes and messes and messes. And then I read through it again and see what seems to be rising to the surface, what patterns are repeated. And then I can start to think, oh, okay, it looks to me like this might be about X or Y. And, after I had a couple, 3, 4 essays for the collection that seemed to be circling around some similar ideas, I thought, okay, well, now I can just write the other 9, which took a long time.
So are you saying you write a bunch of stuff and then narrow it down?
Yeah, that's how I work. Yeah, I sort of subscribe to that E.M. Forster idea of how do I know what I think until I see what I say. It's all just so jumbled in there, I couldn't possibly work with it until I had it down on the paper and had some way of starting to understand things. Do you want one more?
Yeah, I just want more because in the book, the love theme comes through with, obviously, with the man, with the place, even with your stick shift card. But I didn't get the feeling I didn't feel any sense of just love of being a writer. Obviously, you're beautiful at it. But I wonder why you shied away from that or didn't even slip it in there somehow. Because it seems like you just love words, love what they convey. But I didn't feel that you connected yourself with that, but obviously you're very good at it.
Well, I think that certainly the story I read from tonight and the stories in the early part of the book took place before I was a writer. So that wasn't really part of the material. The very last essay in the book, though, is called Fluency, and it's about, indirectly about being a writer. It's about, learning to own language. Yeah, so I think that's the short answer, is that it just wasn't, it wasn't relevant to the stories I was telling at the time that they occurred. Yeah. 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 Thank you so much. What a great audience. I'll be happy to chat.